So again, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you to the museum and to Mike for having me. I'm delighted and honored to be speaking to this audience, and I hope many of you will enjoy our discussion and hopefully the book. And there is right now, I believe, Wayne State University Press, where the book was released, is having a 30% off sale this week. So if you're interested in the book, hopefully it'll be a much more reasonable price than most academic books usually are. I want to talk just that. Thank you for the amazing introduction. It sounds like I've done so many things when actually they all kind of overlap, I think. As you mentioned, this kind of crossover of comics and military history, and of course, masculinity plays into all of that. So I don't really need to cover too much of what I've already done. Or my research or publications. So I'm going to talk about what this book is about, and from that, kind of where our talk today is coming from. So the book is not just about military history, right? It's about the journey that Jewish men have taken to be seen as American men by larger American culture. So it's about the struggles that Jewish men have faced to be seen as equal, to be accepted as men, and their understanding of the importance of that goal in American culture as it's linked to Americanness on the whole. It's also about the assumptions and gendered prejudices that are inherent in anti-Semitic rhetoric, which attacks both Jewish manliness of Jewish men and the femininity of Jewish women. And it's about the ways in which Jewish men have accepted or rejected, embraced, or even praised variant forms of masculinity that are particular or seen as particular to Jewish culture. So, why should we study Jewish manhood? Surprisingly, this is a very under-examined topic. It's really only been talked about in the context of religion and religious history, in film and literature, and somewhat across Europe and in European Jewish cultures. But it's really lacking in historical coverage from an American perspective, or it was at least until, I hope, until this book came out. There's a whole lot on Jewish women and Jewish women's role in culture, really wonderful scholarship on that, but it's really one side of a coin. So a lot of people see Jewish masculinity as fitting into one of several boxes, like the nice Jewish boy or the studious scholar or successful businessman, something like that. And what this book really talks about is, are those ideas real? Where do they come from? And why are they believed? Why are they so long lasting? And most importantly, arguably, how do we research and prove, disprove, or understand them? And my answer to this largely is that in the American context, I embrace the answer that it's through the theories and methods associated with immigration history and the acculturation process. So the process of becoming American really forces newly American Jews to examine their notions of gender and how those kind of are at odds with some of the larger norms in American society. So for our talk today, I want you to consider, because I'm going to be talking about the military and the Jewish American military experience, I want you to consider that masculinity and the desire to be recognized as matching the American masculine ideal was a very real and very important motivation for American Jewish men who saw service in the American armed forces not only as their patriotic duty, but also as a potential proving ground to demonstrate and cultivate their own masculinity in a way that directly linked to American ideals of manhood and nation. And I don't want to give a false impression through the course of this talk that women did not serve, because Jewish women have absolutely been active in the American military and in providing support to the American military for as long as there's been one. And that's truly a large enough topic to be its own separate talk. But for today, since I'm talking about these notions of American manhood, and how they intended to alter their perceptions, that's really what we're focusing on. So there's a reason that I'm beginning with, as you saw in the title of the talk, the Pancho Villa expedition, or the Mexican expedition, which is that this is really a moment when both masculine standards in America and the Jewish role in the American military were being established. Though many of you are aware, I'm sure, that American Jews served in every American war from the Revolutionary War forward, this was an important moment, as by this time, Jews weren't a minuscule minority in the United States, but a growing population, really at the height of mass migration. So among the 10,000 regular army troops and the 100,000 National Guardsmen who participated in the Mexican expedition or the punitive expedition, there were approximately 3,500 Jews. And the American Jewish community's efforts to look after these Jewish soldiers um, really established a precedent for a much larger project that would roll out over the world wars of supporting American Jewish soldiers, beginning World War I and through World War II. And what we now think of, I think, as kind of the heart of the Jewish American military experience. And it's at this time that Jewish civilian agencies really started to be created to provide services to men in uniform alongside their Christian counterparts. So the Young Men's Hebrew Association, which already existed, started setting up bases on the border, the Mexican border, alongside the YMCA, so their Christian counterparts, although their goals were kind of increased from the Christian goals, which, the YMCA set up largely to stop American soldiers from indulging in the temptations at the border and brothels and drinking and things like that, corrupting influences. But the Young Men's Hebrew Association had the kind of added goal of protecting them from organizations like the YMCA, who might have proselytizing missions and potentially kind of un-Jewish influences as well. And it's during this time, in the years leading up to the First World War, that the Jewish Welfare Board was formed, creating an organization which officially partnered with the American government to put Jewish soldiers on slightly more even footing in terms of religious recognition and services provided with their Protestant, even footing with their Protestant and Catholic comrades in arms. And the men themselves, particularly judging by the correspondence that I've read in the archives, show just how much this bringing Jewish men together for the first time in an organized fashion for recreation, for religious practice and celebration really helped to define their Jewish community as soldiers and helped them retain a sense of self, even though a lot of the needs that were unique to Jewish soldiers were still not met, like kosher foods. Which I'm sure the museum content already covers some of that and that history. It also helps just bringing the people together to maintain their spirits, as they still weren't embraced as equal necessarily with their non-Jewish comrades. A lot of them often kept to themselves. One soldier who's pictured here, this is pulled out of an archive from Boston. This soldier, Herbert Gorfick, who also went on to serve in the First World War and the Second, wrote home to his family in Boston regularly with stories of how even on the trains on his way out west, the Jewish soldiers and recruits tended to congregate and bond together because they felt ostracized and othered from the rest of the soldiers. But it wasn't just the sense of community that was created in this time through the bringing together of Jewish enlisted men and the introduction of Jewish organizations working for the soldiers. The expedition also served to solidify a new standard or recognizability of Jewish men in uniform, which had actually begun just before under the leadership of Teddy Roosevelt and specifically his Rough Riders. So when we're thinking about masculinity at the turn of the century, Teddy Roosevelt should be one of the first figures that comes to mind. He had this kind of ideal formula for masculine life, which he wrote about and enacted in himself, right? His whole story was one of kind of masculine redemption, self-making, and he had a lot of theories about how the American frontier could transform boys into men, and even more so, transform emasculated men or weaker men or physically inept men into true, rugged Americans. And his ideal formula for masculine life was a really unique one in the moment, in that he said it was necessary to pair educated intelligence and rugged training on the frontier to create the kind of ideal American man. So Jewish intelligence he saw as a boon. And this is also a presumption of the time, right? That Jews had some kind of innate superior intelligence. So he enlisted very intentionally several Jewish men to work with him throughout his career. And when he commanded the Rough Riders, he chose his men based on a combination of things, not just Jewish men, but all of his soldiers, based on a combination of merit, He tried to pull in a number of Ivy Leaguers and frontier ranchers so that they could kind of cross-pollinate these ideas of manliness to comprise an ideal masculine army. And as I said, he recruited Jewish men into his unit, and he explained, when he was prompted to explain his relationship with Jews, that all of these men had enlisted and performed well alongside their comrades, even noting a few of them who rose to higher ranks. Specifically, he said, one who rose to the rank of lieutenant specifically for acts of gallantry. And he said this because it directly countered the prevailing views of Jews at the time, that they were cowardly or evasive of duty in some way. He also continued to defend his inclusion of Jewish men to critics. He even wrote on behalf of several Jews who tried to enlist but were rejected. And a lot of this was due to his embracing of the melting pot theory. He had a long correspondence with Israel Zangwill, the Jewish territorialist who wrote the play The Melting Pot. But that doesn't mean that, as Mike mentioned in the introduction, that doesn't mean that he didn't also still maintain these kind of scientifically, in air quotes, scientifically based racist views about Jews and Jewish innate qualities, both positive and negative. In the military, however, he did believe that Jews should be able to prove themselves, quote, by the scale we use with Christians, unquote. So he believed that Jewish men were, and he wrote about this, inherently weak physically. But he said this was not a natural predisposition. Jews had been forced into this state by historical context. He wrote, quote, the bulk of the Jewish population, especially immigrants from Russia or Poland, are of weak physique and have not yet gotten far enough away from their centuries of oppression and degradation. I've made up my mind, he said, quote, it would be a particularly good thing for men of the Jewish race to develop that side of them which I might call the Maccabee or fighting Jewish type, unquote. So one of the reasons I like this quote so much is I think it's very interesting that he urged Jewish men not to emulate those white men who they were kind of fighting alongside of in America and on the Western frontier, the way he recommended of his white soldiers. He maintained a distinction between weak Jews and Jewish heroes on the one hand, and weak white men and their masculine counterparts on the other. So he saw several tracks to ideal manhood, specific to the racial theories that he adhered to. But positive examples for both meant that everyone could achieve this goal. Now, before America had joined in the Great War, and I'm moving forward because there's quite a bit I want to get to, but I'm happy to come back to any of this in the Q&A. Before America had joined in the Great War, Jews in the U.S. were gratefully left out of what was a horrific and fratricidal war for the international Jewish community, because Jews were fighting in every armed conflict throughout the war. And yet, even though they had kind of escaped this misery that I talk about in the book of having to face other Jews on the battlefield, both American and Palestinian Jews saw the poor and unequal situation of European Jews in various nations as a justification to join the fight even before America had entered the war. And this was certainly the case among those Jews expelled from settlements in and around Jaffa by the Turkish government in 1914. Among the over 10,000 Jewish refugees that were gathered in Alexandria, Egypt, were Jewish veterans of Russian and Yishuv fighting and defense forces. And two of those veterans, Captain Joseph Trumpeldor and Vladimir Jabotinsky, who would then become a leader in the revisionist Zionist movement, proposed an all-Jewish army to fight under British command on the Sinai Desert, which would become inevitably, they argued, a fighting front in the war. And they were turned down for work as soldiers by the British government. But 652 of these Jewish would-be soldiers became the Zion Mule Corps, carrying food and ammunition to non-Jewish British forces in the trenches, and proving their resolve to the British government. And by 1917, British forces began training a group of these men in London to be the new leaders of the Jewish Legion, an actual combat unit, which formed at the end of 1916. So this wasn't American military, but American Jews were absolutely vital to its ranks as it progressed. So Jews from the US eagerly joined up into the Jewish Legion, They joined to fight in any way they could, just as Theodore Roosevelt had advocated, to become men in the theater of war. The formation of the Jewish Legion abroad, paired with the fact that the U.S. had not yet joined the fight, really gave these potential soldiers unprecedented opportunity to fight as Jews, which not only their generation, but for dozens of generations before hadn't had the opportunity. And interest only increased after the Balfour Declaration of 1917 started spurring hope for this Jewish homeland being established in Palestine. Within the Jewish Legion, North American men constituted the largest contingent of volunteers, forming entirely American battalions who made their way to Palestine via training camps in Canada. American Jews volunteered in the Legion despite legal and practical impediments, especially once America had joined the war, primarily their age. A lot of underage Jewish Americans signed up, and of course their American citizenship, which strictly prohibited citizens from serving in a foreign army. For those who were exempted from the American draft, those restrictions weren't really insurmountable, right? They weren't eligible, and therefore they could go fight somewhere else. But a lot of Jews did lie about their age. Some who were fully eligible for the American draft went so far as to forfeit their American citizenship to join the Legion. And Jewish girls also showed interest but were turned away. I mentioned one of them in the book who was turned away, a young Golda Meir, the first female president or first female prime minister of Israel, who was absolutely crushed by being turned away from the Legion. She saw this as her real opportunity to fight. And the US government allowed the Jewish Legion to recruit men who were otherwise not subject to the draft. But a lot of American Jews were kind of torn about this, especially the idea of relinquishing American citizenship, right? They were already fighting so hard to be seen as patriots and considered themselves patriots. So the people that particularly were against this recruiting were intentional American assimilationists, anti-Zionists, and even those Zionists who were really concerned about the perception of Jewish dual loyalties, which is a long-standing accusation against Jews in most Western countries. They saw Jewish Americans as owing their full allegiance to the United States and that they should stay and wait to serve in the American Armed Forces. But for the most part, Legionnaires' personal accounts as they were heading, up to Canada for training and overseas were that they were met with joy from the American Jewish communities that they passed through as they made their way out, that they were seen as heroes in the community. The end of the war in 1918 cut off the flow of American volunteers to the Legion at its height. So though about 5,000 volunteers were actively fighting in Palestine on Armistice Day, 5,600 more, predominantly American Jewish men, were in transit or in training to join the battle. So the amount of people who were signing up was just increasing exponentially as the war went on. And the Jewish Legion was the first fighting Jewish military body since the Roman Empire, to give you an idea of how unprecedented that opportunity was, and arguably served as inspiration for future iterations of Jewish militaries and defense forces of what would become the state of Israel. Now, Jewish men found in the Legion this stage on which they could demonstrate or manifest their strength, Jewish nationalism, pride, honor, and courage. One Jewish colonel told his battalion, quote, "to be brave and heroic, knowing full well that the eyes of the Gentile world were upon them, the Gentile world which, for centuries, mocked the Jews as cowards," unquote. So this desire to prove themselves wasn't secondary, right? I mean, it was obviously there were a lot of different motivating factors: protection of Jews on the whole, the Jewish Zionist project, but this was not a small goal to correct this view of Jews as evasive of service. The thing I really want to dwell on the longest here is this idea. I put the task of setting the record straight. So this quote I put up is from the Jewish war veterans of the US, and it's "Myths die hard. And one of the hardiest is the canard that the Jew does not make a good soldier." So heading into the First World War, veterans recalled the need to disprove stereotypes of Jewish weakness, to show Jews as equal to all other men in war, and this rise in militance as the mark of a man is really clear in their personal accounts and in the accounts from the Jewish war veterans in the archives. But so is the need to persistently battle these accusations of Jewish evasion of service. Um, in all, approximately 225,000 Jews, both native born and immigrants, served as Americans in the First World War. So, for Jews in the United States, the scrutiny of their manliness, as exemplified by the willingness and capacity to fight, was a constant struggle. But it wasn't only the struggle, it was also the struggle to then showcase their successes, showcase their participation. So they were combating accusations of Jews as evasive of duty, but they were clearly also distinguishing, and this is interesting, between American Jews and American Jewish immigrants. So the birthplace was really important in their kind of recognition of some of these anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish accusations as based in reality. So throughout the duration of the war, I mean, these accusations persisted regardless of the numbers of Jewish enlistment. But in June of 1918, just a few months before the First World War ended, an American Jew named Lewis Brown published an article in the North American Review addressing this supposed determination of Jews not to fight. And he examined in this article a statement from an instruction manual for the Medical Advisory Board of the draft, which stated that, quote, the foreign born, especially the Jews, are more apt to malinger than the native born, unquote. And what's interesting is that in his defense of Jewish soldiering, Brown doesn't deny that foreign-born Jews may be prone to malingering, but he explains that it's only those who haven't Americanized. He even defends their slacking, his word, by claiming that it was unique. So he said, quote, they are slackers, of course, but their slacking is not sneaky, mean, and yellow. It's red. It's imbued with a particular zeal and passion. It's a type of slacking altogether anomalous, and for that reason, most impressive to the American born and bred, unquote. So he clarifies that the difference between Jews who had absorbed this American manly character by having Americanized and those who are still too foreign in their Jewishness. And he gives kind of a threefold explanation for Jewish malingering, which he does not deny. He actually says this is based in reality, which I'm not necessarily agreeing with, just recounting the kind of language of the time. The first element, he argues, is that Jews are naturally averse to war because of Jewish teachings. He said that the Jew is, quote, constitutionally antipathetic, constitutionally antipathetic to physical violence. He has nothing of the berserker in him, unquote. And the second of his statements really mirrors Roosevelt and even Theodore Herzl about this emasculation of Jewish men by historical context. He argues that the martial spirit, quote, has been almost crushed underneath centuries of servility and oppression. Powers neglected tend to atrophy. And so men unable to use physical force lose altogether the sense of fight. Their bodies wither, they must live by their wits, unquote. The third reason that he gave for foreign-born Jews malingering, regardless of regarded the memories that they retained of the brutal draft and military services in their home countries, primarily those from Russia, which was, of course, kind of at peak migration at the time of this writing. And he explained that although he may have done the same if he were from the old country, as an American Jew, he said that he knew, quote, that here the soldiery is clean and fine and manly. Yes, he said, I know all of this, but, and here lies the root of the evil, my un-Americanized brother does not, unquote. So here he's kind of defending the foreign-born Jewish immigrants and what he sees as their very real reluctance to join the military. The Medical Advisory Board removed this slur on Jews in February of 1918 at the request of President Wilson. And that was in direct response to a telegram that he received from Lewis Marshall, the president of the American Jewish Committee. And not all leaders clearly agreed with Brown's assessment of the slacking nature of foreign-born Jews. A lot of them even made these really public efforts to combat the image of Jews as slackers or malingerers of any kind. For example, a New York rabbi led a call specifically to enlist Austro-Hungarian Jews in the military, and he planned to expand these efforts to Jews of other foreign birth as well, to show these entire populations of Jews could be recruited and fight for America. Several notable leaders of the time, primarily of German Jewish heritage, including Jacob Schiff, formed a Jewish anti-pacifist group in New York called the American League of Jewish Patriots in 1917. And they existed specifically to encourage Jewish American men to enlist in the armed forces. And their leaders claimed that through this Americanization process, the values of democracy would inspire them to fight. They explained that, quote, he who was originally a slacker is now among the first to volunteer, and on the battlefield, he is the renowned hero, unquote. The Jewish war veterans and the American Jewish Committee both started putting out publications as well to make this an even more public-facing, to make the public even more aware of Jewish action. So, as the war wrapped up, the AJC, the American Jewish Committee Office of Jewish War Records, released a report on Jewish participation, which is pictured here on the upper left, as, quote, an instrument wherewith to combat certain manifestations of anti-Jewish prejudice in the immediate present. So this report reveals a few things about the American anti-Semitism on the whole. Its emphasis on emasculation, and it tells us something about the Jewish reactions to this prejudice. So first, the Office of Jewish War Records released this report unnecessarily early, as there were still troops mobilized, so they couldn't actually count a lot of the soldiers or casualties or medals of valor, which would be awarded. So those would have been in the final tally, but they saw it as so urgent to get this out that it was published very quickly. It's also clear in the report that the Office of Jewish War Records took these claims of malingering and evasion as attacks on Jewish manliness and honor, because it reads somewhat less as a participation record than it does as a determined effort to prove Jewish tenacity. So a section is devoted entirely to the role of Jewish soldiers as combatants versus non-combatants, to explain that far more Jews wanted to fight than they did organize. And another section on volunteers explains that so many Jews in service were outside of the draft age that their excessive numbers couldn't be coincidence or happenstance, but that Jews were surely overrepresented due to high levels of patriotism and valor. The office's director, Julian Levitt, concluded in the report, quote, Jews of America have contributed their full quota to the winning of the war, and a generous margin beyond their quota, that they have enlisted cheerfully, fought gallantly, and died bravely for the United States. The qualities which have enabled the Jew to survive through the centuries, his capacity to endure without breaking, prolonged and intense nerve strain, his qualities of initiative, his elasticity of mind, his capacity for organization, and above all, his idealism, enabled him to fit himself successfully into a democratic army fighting for world democracy, unquote. So he's really explaining that it was for the outside world that this report was published, for those who didn't recognize or didn't believe in these facts of Jewish valor, that the Jewish War Records Office had to exist and had to compile and publicize this data. One of the great tasks of this Jewish American project of becoming men through military service was less the actual service and more the fighting to maintain this progress that had been made in the eyes of the American public. And the Jewish war veterans really became the torchbearers for this particular struggle. Though it wasn't necessarily intentional, the defense of more pacifist attitudes among Jews and promoted by Jewish leaders really helped to perpetuate some of these prevalent views of Jews as timid by fighting for the rights of Jews to avoid military service on the grounds of religious belief. And the Jewish war veterans kind of led the charge against that. In June of 1936, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, or CCAR, adopted a resolution at their annual convention that sought the exemption of Jews from military service, quote, in accordance with the highest interpretation of Judaism, unquote. And they included in this resolution that exemption from military service had long been granted to members of the Quaker Society of Friends and similar religious organizations. The pronouncement met with an enormous backlash from the Jewish community, particularly from Jewish veterans of the First World War, who saw this as a slap in the face, not only to their service to their country, but also to their service in the image of the American Jew and Jewish men. Julius Klausner Jr., who was the intelligence officer for the Jewish war, an intelligence officer for the Jewish war veterans, wrote in response to this pronouncement that American Jews were painfully shocked by the resolution. He wrote, the Jewish war veterans adopted a resolution of their own in which he wrote, categorically, quote, categorically, we deny that fighting for one's country is inconsistent with the highest interpretations of Judaism. We deny that patriotism is to be confused with militarism. We deny the right of any Jew to exemption on religious grounds. We deny that patriotic veterans love peace any less than do self-styled pacifists. JWV stands for Shalom with honor. In one fell stroke, he wrote, do these rabbis give credence and support to the charge that the Jew is a pacifist and a cowardly avoider of the obligations of citizenship, unquote. So this officer, through the JWV, adds that in the biblical history of the Jews, the passage to, quote, go forth and smite thine enemies was a commandment to walk along with our fellow man with dignity, not as, quote, flinching cowards. The American Jew, the modern Jew, he said, must be prepared to fight just as did the Maccabees and the Jewish military heroes of biblical, medieval, and modern history, unquote. While he's clearly arguing that Jewish men aren't weak and that Jews have a history of heroism and battle, the recrimination, flinching cowards, is clearly a jab at those rabbis in the CCAR who were behaving just as they were expected to behave by anti-Semites who claimed that Jews could not be patriots. One of the greatest fears that veterans voiced to CCAR was the reaction of those men serving from other faiths within the armed forces. They argued that those men might end up far away defending their country while Jews remained at home, enjoying peace and the fruits of war. And these letters that they wrote to the CCAR show a real fear that the hard work that the Jewish veterans had put into correcting this old image of Jews as evasive or as cowardly or as emasculated was being nullified through their statements, and that the American masses would begin to again see Jews this way. So they were clearly worried, not that Jews would actually refuse to fight. They didn't see that as a problem, but they thought that it was the image of Jews as able or willing to fight that would be so damaged. I want to leave time because I also see hands going up, so I don't have the time to fully examine all the context around it, but I want to mention one more thing, which is this In the Nation's Service pamphlet, which was released in 1942. I'm just going to bring us forward a little bit to the Second World War, because it's interesting to me that this pamphlet was released with the exact same kind of sense of urgency as the one that was released in 1919. It clearly showed this In the Nation's Service is a very similar pamphlet full of collected articles, obituaries, and statements by public officials celebrating Jewish bravery and Americans fighting in the war. And the articles addressed specifically addressed and refuted these statements about Jewish cowardice that were still going on at the time of its publication in 1942, just still, right at the beginning of America joining the war. And it stated, it was addressing these, quote, for the American sons of Israel who are writing their names in imperishable letters of fire across the skies of glory, along with the Americans of every other faith and racial origin. These Jewish boys in this war are no more heroic than anyone else, but surely they are no less, unquote. So In the Nation's Service really paints this picture of numerical overrepresentation of Jewish Americans who are proudly joining the fight, and it kind of hints that the anti-Semitism of the past is melting away. However, the very fact that the Jewish Welfare Board published this piece 1 year into the war really demonstrates their belief in the necessity of disproving these criticisms through celebrations of Jewish valor in real time. So I bring this up to show that this is still an ongoing issue that Jews are addressing as the wars begin and continue. So this hasn't even remotely been an exhaustive discussion of the ways in which Jewish military service directly related to Jewish masculine image over the short period covered. But I do address all of this at much greater length and depth in the book, which I hope that some of you will consider reading. And to the best of my ability, I'm happy to address any questions that you may have. And I want to thank you for all of your time, and honored to have the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you, Miriam. That was fascinating. So I'm interested in the two kind of ideas you presented in World War I about encouraging Jewish military service. The Jabotinsky Jewish Legion serve as a Jew, and I guess the Jacob Schiff idea serve as an American patriot. Did you get much of a sense if those were thought of as oppositional philosophies, and if how influential they both were?
Sorry, you actually cut out for just a second. Can you
Yeah,
repeat
so
which two philosophies?
yeah, so the Jabotinsky serving as a Jew, the Jewish Legion folks, then the Jacob Schiff idea of serving as an American patriot, and how influential were they both? Were they viewed as oppositional philosophies or complementary philosophies? Did you get a sense of how those ideas reached the men?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that the Jewish Legion and the recruiting for the Jewish Legion, which of course, it it decreased dramatically when America joined the war. I mean, I think that the appeal was really different, right? Because as I said, the Jewish Legion was this opportunity to fight as Jews, and there were really, I mean, Jews, and I'm sure everybody in your audience today is as aware of this as we are. But there's no one statement about Jews or the way Jews think or what Jews believe that could ever be accurate, because it's a vastly conflicting and different kind of group. Um, but I think that Jews were of several minds during the wars, right? There was this kind of this desire to prove Americanness, right? As much as masculinity or anything like that. I mean, arguably much more so. Masculinity is just a feature of that struggle. But also there's a desire to fight for Jews who are being very specifically oppressed, right? Leading up to World War I, and even more so in World War II. So, I mean, I think that once America joined the war, the focus really shifted, and American Jews were much more likely to kind of eagerly join as Americans. But there was something unique about the Jewish Legion and about what Jabotinsky was doing, which was organizing an entirely Jewish unit led by Jews I mean, it was for the Allied powers, but it was also very specifically for Jewish interests because it was in Mandate Palestine.
So, do you think the World War I service, hundreds to a couple 100,000, up to 250,000 Jews in service, did it make an impact on the stereotypical perception of American Jews? And then what kind of happens once we get into the 20s and the war is in the rearview mirror?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think it made a difference. You see things, by the Second World War. So after the First World War, you see a lot of things, notable things changing, like Wilson removing that statement from the medical advisory boards. Public commentary starts to shift away from this language about Jews as unwilling or unable, right? That language is kind of starts to roll back. So I do think that the service, and especially these publications where, Jewish American communities are saying, look what we've done, look how American we are, look how much we've served. I think that those did make an impact. Unfortunately, what happens in the 20s and in the early 30s is a rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic organizations in the United States like we've never seen. We have, major figures like Henry Ford and Father Coughlin, coming out of the Midwest, right, who are not only vilifying Jews, by reprinting the protocols of the elders of Zion and all of this, but also talking about the corrupting influence of migrant communities in the United States through like the America First movement and things like that. So I think that when anti-Semitism starts to rise in the late 20s and early 30s, a lot of that progress starts to backslide. But in a different way, right? I mean, the exact same accusations don't come in. When the Second World War starts, most of the anti-Semitic rhetoric that we read about among soldiers in the military is much less about Jewish cowardice and much more about Jews having a different interest in the war, right? Like it's really not about fighting for America; it's about fighting for the Jews in Europe. So that the rhetoric changes. So I do think it had an effect. I just think that kind of was stifled by rising anti-Semitism on a different count.
Here's a comment in the Q&A from Morris Doonan. No matter what Jews do, we are always discriminated against. Maybe publicly we are more accepted, but as a Jew, you can still not move next to Teddy or Franklin Roosevelt's neighborhood.
That's an interesting statement, especially the neighborhood statement is particularly interesting. I have I don't know. There's an anecdote from my family that reminds me of. My grandparents were relatively wealthy in the Chicago area, and their neighborhood, the Black community started to move in, and it had been a fairly Jewish neighborhood, and so they were looking to move elsewhere. And they had put their house on the market, and they were shopping around, and they were touring this beautiful house in this other neighborhood. And the white woman who was showing them around said, "Oh, you're going to love this place. You know, I mean, the neighborhood is kind of going downhill. A couple of Jews have moved in, but like other than that, it's fine." And they decided to stay. My family stayed in their neighborhood. But I mean, I think that's anti-Semitism is, you know, it's pervasive. There are all these different kind of tendrils of it. My argument is to add the discussion of gender more into general discussions of anti-Semitism, because I think it gives us a better understanding of not only what it is and where it comes from, but how it manifests and how to combat it. I don't know if that really addressed that specific comment, but I hear you.
How did you make any generalization about how much of the anti-Semitism, and then I guess stereotyping, that the less vicious form of anti-Semitism, is holdovers from Europe versus a unique American brand?
Oh, definitely. So I talk about that a lot in the book. Um, there's so the kind of so what I talk about is how there's these anti-Semitic notions of Jewish manhood that evolve in Europe for very specific reasons, right? Jews in Europe were, subject to sumptuary laws and restricted in terms of, land ownership, professions they could engage in, um, ways they could live, what they could wear, right? And all of these things kind of contributed to Jewish society evolving and changing in a way that's separate from the nation state in which they were living. So as nationalism develops and manhood becomes so tied to nationalism, these ideas of like being fully, say, German or is fully Austrian, which have to do with, running a family and working the land and being connected to the land. Well, Jews weren't allowed to work the land, or Jews weren't allowed to own land. So these separate forms of manhood in Jewish society evolved and were very, real and respectable within Jewish society, like the Jew as scholar, right? Which meant that a lot of Jewish women ended up taking on the breadwinning roles in families. And that was considered a mark of a successful man, is if you were able to study Talmud and your wife was able to run the shop, or your daughters or your mother-in-law or whoever, then that was a sign of success. So that's really just like a parallel development. But those ideas that then are linked to manhood and nation, which rejected Jews because of this kind of role they'd been forced into, those were imported to the US by both Jewish and non-Jewish immigrants. So Jews had to adapt as they came in during the mass migration period to American norms of gender, like women buying into this, this cult of domesticity, women being relegated to the household instead of being breadwinners. And that was a major shift too, that kind of created new forms of American anti-Semitic notions of gender.
Okay, Alan Rich asks, does your book discuss the Spanish-American War? If not, do you know of any books that discuss Jewish soldiers in that war? It does, but any other reading you can recommend, or anything you want to say about the Spanish-American War?
I mean, I would definitely recommend Jessica Cooperman's book. I mean, her book really focused on World War I, but there was a lot of lead up and um,
Yeah, so her book addresses the establishment of the Jewish Welfare Board as that organization that once there's a huge number of Jews in service,
mm,
we need a welfare organization that's specifically for Jews. So yeah, it does get at the origins there.
yeah, I do think it is an area that needs more scholarly attention. I really do. I mean, specifically, I think, um, I mean, I'm trying to remember the name of an article that I read about Jews in the Spanish-American War, but I cannot off the top of my head.
Yeah,
But I think it's in my footnotes.
there's some older stuff that falls into the same kind of trying to show that Jews served just like everyone else, and some of it is seriously problematic because they do the if you got a Jewish name, stick them on the list thing,
Mm,
and often people with Jewish names are in fact not Jewish. They just have a kind of Jewish sounding name. So yeah, so that I mean that's one of the problems doing this history that you run into. You know, people trying to show that Jews did serve as they did. Don't always get it right when that's the goal rather than can rather than showing the history.
mm.
But so yeah, that's definitely yeah. So I think I'm thinking of stuff that goes back 100 years or more.
Oh, like Simon Wolf.
Simon Wolfe's
Hmm.
1895 book. So that's before the Spanish American War, but that's exactly what I'm talking about for
Yeah,
the Revolution, the Civil War, and the earlier
absolutely.
stuff.
Hmm. Yeah, and those numbers are problematic. Although recently, I don't know if you're familiar. I'm sure you're familiar with the Chappelle roster, which launched.
Yeah, yeah. So they're
Yeah,
doing great work. So that
great work.
database of Civil War soldiers, everyone should check that out if you're interested in the Civil War.
Certainly.
Uh, a question from Sheldon Goldberg on military leaders praising the performance of Jews. To what extent did comments from military leaders about the excellent performance of Jews affect the perception of Jews in the military and as citizens? And he cites Pershing and the fact that there were three Medal of Honor recipients during World War One.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. One of the things that I know I talk about, you know, through at least through the world wars, and I think before, is that even when I think the intention is I want to say pure, it's what's a pure intention, but even when the intention is very say philo-Semitic, you know, when they're hoping to do a service to the Jewish people, a lot of the time the language, and this is because they're kind of arguing against a pre-existing notion of Jews as not good soldiers, right? But a lot of the language in built into the praise is that this Jew is exceptional, right? You see it specifically like around the character of Sam Drebin, who was
Mhm.
this, you know, foreign-born soldier who served. I mean, there were poems about Damon Runyon wrote about him. I have a whole poem about him in the
Yeah,
called Drebin the Jew, the fighting
fighting
Jew.
Jew. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And the problem, you know, as well intentioned as, you know, the statements from like military seniors and leaders and generals about these Jews, just like Roosevelt. Roosevelt did the same thing, as they'd say, like, well, like this is the good Jew, right? When Roosevelt wrote about Oscar Strauss, and how amazing he was, right? He said he's one of the, you know, be a good Jew like this Jew, right? Oscar, yeah, I think so. He's be a good Jew like this Jew, right? You are capable. The Jewish people are capable of being great, like this example. But unfortunately, lifting up an individual in that way, couched in this language of exceptionalism, doesn't actually help to further the cause as much as it does to highlight them as an outlier. So I think that the work of the Jewish Welfare Board and of the Jewish War Veterans, the publications I had up, I think that was actually kind of low level more effective because it talked about numbers and larger inclinations of Jewish Americans as opposed to these exceptional soldiers.
Let's see. Here's a kind of long comment from Jonathan Newmark on Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt did have lots of Jewish neighbors. He had a personal medical history which relates to Dr. Moore's comments. He had severe asthma as a child and polluted, dirty New York City. He overcame it originally by spending time at his uncle's country place in Maplewood, New Jersey, a few blocks from where I grew up, where he developed a taste for the outdoors life. Later, he lost his mother and his first wife, moved to North Dakota as a rancher. He saw his own progression as an upward movement from indoors feet to New York life to the manly cowboy style. By the time he became XO of the Rough Riders, He saw Jewish immigrants as having come from an analogously polluted, cramped background and people who were capable of having the same transformation that had turned him into a more complete male.
Hmm. Yeah, and he was criticized in a lot of the same language, right? A lot of the same language that people used to degrade Jews at the time. People called him Jane Dandy, and there was all this kind of like, arguably, to use like modern language, homophobic rhetoric around his presentation, the way that he moved through the world, and he did believe that that exact same transformation is exactly what the Jewish people needed, which I do think is very interesting. And for more on that, I recommend, if whoever that commenter was, if you're interested in it, Michael Kimmel wrote a book on American masculinity, American manhood in history. That has a whole section on Teddy Roosevelt and that history, which is very interesting, and his commentary on it. Less
So
about the Jews.
yeah, okay, let's finish up. We just got time for about one more, and we have one from the current national commander of Jewish War Veterans of the USA, Gary Ginsberg. So that group goes back to the group of Civil War vets, still operating today, formed in 1896. And Gary asked, did the Jewish contribution in World War One have an impact on acceptance into university campuses and country clubs?
Such a great question, Gary. Thank you. It did. I think that it did. I have actually a whole chapter or a whole section of a chapter. I can't remember because shamefully I've not read my own book in like 2 years, but since before it was published, because I've read it enough. But there's a whole section on fraternal organizations and athletic clubs, right? And those athletic clubs and country clubs pretty closely tied together. What's interesting, I think, is I don't think it had an effect on the admissions process, the quota system that was kind of a separate struggle. Um, but I do include several accounts from fraternity members whose kind of entire project during the First World War became like their newsletters shifted from being about the fraternities, Jewish fraternities on campus, to really being about the war correspondence with their members overseas. So a lot of like underage members, high school members who kind of pre-pledged ended up running these newsletters for the Jewish fraternities at the universities in America, and kind of talking about how all of their fraternity brothers had enlisted, and how this was changing the view of them on campus. So I don't think it really changed the way that universities discriminated in admissions. But I do think that those publications made a difference to their kind of sense of self and their acceptance on campus in some ways. Um, it's a really good question.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, we're just about at the end of our time. So I just want to thank everyone for being on. We were recording this, and we hopefully will be able to send out a link to the recording, and we can include a link to purchase the book and other information to everyone that registered. Miriam, do you have any final words?
Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to speak at this museum virtually, and to this audience. So thank you all for your patience and sticking with us.
Yeah, we'll have to get you in here in person sometime. And thank you so much for being on today. Thanks everyone, and we'll see you the next time.
Thank you.